It's here. It's now. It's Wine Talks with Paul K.
Hey, welcome to Wine Talks with Paul K. And we are in studio today in beautiful Southern California, about to have a conversation with Alex Gambal out in Jackson, Wyoming. Introductions in just a moment. Wine Talks, of course, available on iHeartRadio, Pandora, Spotify, wherever you hang out for your podcasting. Have a listen to a re-release I put out last week of the great Mel Masters. Melvin and Janie Masters were English by birth, moved to Provence, France. They created one of the great negociant brands in America called Les Gemelles, and we just lost them. And it's a great story. It's a great view of the American wine industry through somebody who's been on all sides. So have a listen to Mel Masters and Janie Masters, actually. But now while we're here today, here to have a conversation with Alex Gambal. I'm not sure what to call him. He's a winemaker from Burgundy. He's American. We're going to establish that. And he's written a book called Climbing the Vines in Burgundy. Welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul. Appreciate it.
As you're out in your car in Jackson, Wyoming, which is a beautiful part of the country, but it begs me to understand, and I think I sarcastically asked the question off camera, are you really American? And so,
yes, it's a long story that I ended up moving from the Washington, D.C. area in '93 to France to work with Becky Wasserman, just literally to take a year off with my wife and two kids, and ended up staying and going to the wine school and developing a domain of 30 acres, 12 hectares.
Yeah, so that you just said a mouthful, and I don't know if the listeners understand that, so I'm going to peel it back a little bit for them so they get the lay of the land. Burgundy, of course, is this wonderful swath of land that runs sort of north-south, a couple hours out of Paris, known for its Pinot Noir, of course, and Chardonnay, the two sanctioned grapes of the district, but historically one of the great districts of the world for wine. And evidenced by the comment that I think we were talking about earlier about Jason Pallmeyer having said, all enophiles, anybody that studies wine, eventually you end up in Burgundy because it's just so fascinating and you can never learn it all. But why Burgundy? I mean, if you said you were working in real estate in Washington, D.C., you met Becky at a wine shop or a tasting, and Burgundy popped up. And I think in an interview I read about you, you said that Burgundy found you.
That's what I was going to say, Paul. I mean, I don't think you can choose to be in Burgundy. It has to choose you. I think it's hard to understand how small it is, yet complex at the same time. And most importantly, I was open to the possibilities. And, I think you have to be a very curious person and a very patient person to learn about Burgundy and go into Burgundy. And quite frankly, most Americans don't have that patience. We want instant gratification. We want scalability and all that kind of stuff. And that is exactly the opposite of what Burgundy is, which makes it so wonderful and also so maddening at the same time.
I did a tasting the other day at some friend's house. It was sort of impromptu. It was actually Armenian wines that are not necessarily ready for the world-class stage, but they're very good. They're well made. And we started tasting wines, and they have structure. They have some acid. They have some fruit. Some of them are balanced nicely. But then I brought out this giant California cab, that's Paso Robles. It's a huge, voluptuous thing, probably some residual sugar. And they all flipped over it. They all like, wow, this is amazing. Now, we had tasted some pretty nice wines. But the reason that they flipped over it was this extraction, which is sort of the California Napa palate, the Paso palate as well, where there's tons of fruit and it's inky in your glass. And Burgundy's not that way. Burgundy, man, in its finest form is so complex and layered. And when you look at the glass, you kind of go, wow, this, what's in this glass? It doesn't look too heavy. But man, oh man, it certainly pulls a ton from the soil. Was that fascinating to you when you got there?
Absolutely. And it still is. I opened a bottle the other night. I had an old bottle from Henri Boyau, great old domain. don't know the year, don't know the etiquettes. They didn't know what appellation, but it was freaking great. It probably was early 60s, very little color. But I had people who are used to those kind of big wines to go, wow, this is spectacular.
Yeah.
Because you get these layers, you get this nuance that you don't get with anywhere else in the world. And some people, those big wines, there is a market for them. But it was never my thing in the beginning. And people said, "Oh, are you going to make American style wines in France?" Well, I never made wine before. I mean, I learned everything there. So my palate was formed in this very nuanced, elegant style, which I'm still attracted to.
That's an interesting thought, because it's a dream of mine, and I'm very close to, like we talked about Jean Charles. I'm very close to Frederic Barnier at Louis Jadot, and I've had this dream to do this, to go to Burgundy, stage, for the listeners, stage day, a stagiaire. That's in the world of cuisine, that's the day you work for free at a restaurant to see if they like you.
We call it slave boys and slave girls. Exactly.
Right, exactly. I don't know how to get away with it in that industry, because I could have never gotten away with it here in California.
Right.
Just for a little background, my daughter's a French-trained boulangère. She went to Alain Decasse's patisserie school, and she worked in Paris. So we're really familiar with all that part of the world. But Burgundy's a pretty exclusive place. So you and I could go to Bordeaux tomorrow and buy a chateau. And the Paulmeyer comment I made, or the quote I gave you, was part of that was because he was X'd out of a piece of property that was already in escrow through some 12th century rule about selling to outsiders, et cetera. How did they receive you well in the beginning, in the middle, and the end? How did that go?
The whole time. So moving over there and having two young kids, 6 and 8, or actually 8 and 10 at the time. We threw them into French schools. They became bilingual very quickly. And, Burgundy is like, on the world stage, a big B, but in size and number of people, it's a very small B. It's a small little community. And my kids in the local schools, many of their friends' parents are winemakers. So I became involved with it. And also by working with Becky Wasserman, with some of the best winemakers in the world, I became their friends, and I got there when I was 36 years old. I was a baby boomer as they were, and I became part of the community. And that was kind of having that. I had real, what's the term? People trusted me, and they knew I could taste really well, and they also knew at the end, I knew more about the vineyards than many Burgundians did, because I bought grapes from so many different places. And at the end, I had 30 acres of vines, but I think when you're talking about the size and the complexity, I had 45 separate parcels. The average size, about a half an acre, where you make 3, 4, 5 barrels of wine. And most American winemakers or world winemakers go, "What are you doing? Doesn't make any sense." Well, that's the beauty, and also the curse of Burgundy, is that you have these small parcels that are passed down through the families, and to be able to consolidate them is virtually impossible. Now, just to be clear, anyone can buy any piece of land if you can, make a deal on it. The problem is, and I write about this in my book, is the real estate laws favor the tenant. So when we talk about domains, I think it's important to understand that a domain is in a family, but it could be actually third-party leases. It could be leases with your cousins who own a piece of the land, all under domain Gambal or domain Smith or domain Paul. And so this complexity of the land ownings, and then also at the end giving the tenant if you will, the right of first refusal to buy the land or to release it, means there's very little turnover. And that leads to more expense and more complexity.
When you say tenant, you mean the farming of it, or you mean the actual?
The farming of it.
Yeah.
The farming of it. So even in land that I own, for example, I owned them in partnerships, but I leased it back from myself.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And then I had third-party leases. I had 20, 25 third-party leases that I farmed, and that was all under domain Gambal. And this is what's hard to kind of get a handle on. And my domain was very, very typical. Most people have 30, 40, 50 separate parcels over a 20-mile distance. So it's very hard to get costs down and to make any kind of it's not a rational system. It's totally irrational. And that's why we love Burgundy. You've got to be a little crazy.
You got to be a little irrational. And it also explains why there's so many boutique Burgundy brands that have so many different sell so many different appellations. I mean, you could have a small maker with 10 or 15 different appellated wines. I mean, Louis Jadot has like 100. I mean, it's like ridiculous, right?
I made at least 30 different wines.
It's so fascinating.
I mean, and it's funny. I think about it often about, compare it to Bordeaux or other areas where you're making one, maybe two wines. And I would find that boring. What's fascinating is you have these different vineyards, these different expressions. And obviously at the higher level of the appellation, you're getting more expression. Let's not say, there's terroir everywhere, but the idea is that you have these personalities and you learn about these different vineyards over 15, 20, 25 years as you do your children. And that's what makes it fun, is that you have all these different wines. Now, the downside is you got to sell all these bloody different named wines that people can't pronounce, and there's not enough volume for the distributors. So that's the downside to it. And as a consumer, if you find a wine you like, how can I get enough of it so I can drink it all year? And that's the curse and the beauty of Burgundy. One of the many.
There's an interesting piece of that, in that starting from the beginning, when the nuances of the appellation. I always find it fascinating that the monks in the 12th century, 11th century, even I think down to the 9th century, and I guess maybe because all they had was time on their hands, were able to define the nuances between the different plots of land, which can be even 1 or 2 hectares, and across the street, you've got a completely different terroir than the one on the other side. And I find that interesting. And I think the argument, I think a lot of people that are listening to the show should understand that because Burgundy is one red grape, which is the most prolific of all the grapes they have there, and it's Pinot Noir, that you're really, particularly when you have one domain like you, where you're now just getting grapes from the various appellations, but it's one winemaker, same barrels, same types of barrels, whatever you're doing, that you're really just expressing, if you're doing it properly and humbly and with humility, you're actually producing something that's reflective of what you got. And so is the argument not against Bordeaux, but with Bordeaux, that, well, Bordeaux, it comes down to the skill set of the winemaker to blend, up to the 5 grapes to make something that's, this whole is greater than the sum of its parts, versus the skill set of a winemaker in Burgundy who's working with one grape across different terroir. So I think that's just an interesting argument, or just an interesting discussion.
Paul, it's one of those conversations that is intellectually interesting, probably as a consumer, you're going, what are you talking about? But the answer is yes. And this sounds maybe heretical, but one of the problems, especially Chardonnay, is Chardonnay you can make in very small batches, much more easily than Pinot Noir or red grapes. You need a certain volume with red grapes to get a homogeneity in it. So it's I'm losing my train of thought. Yeah. Oh yeah. So one of the ironies in Burgundy is you get all these small little parcels of different, say, Premier Crus, and people will pay for, let's say, a Chambolle-Musigny Les Amoureux, which is like basically sells for the price of a Grand Cru, and less for another couple other Premier Crus. Well, I found that you actually, if you blend several of these small, if you only have as a barrel each of 4 or 5 separate Premier Crus, you blend those together, they will taste better than the individual parts. because you need a certain physical mass with red wine. Remember, when you're making red wine, imagine you're making it, you're cooking it in a crock pot for 2 or 3 weeks at around 90 degrees, 80 to 90 degrees. And you need that, if you will, or all the flavors blend together. If you only have a small, let's say a quarter of that or a fifth of that, you're going to get a very, very different result. And this is because this is the physics of making wine. With Chardonnay, as I said, you can just press the equivalent of 1 barrel of grapes and you put it in a barrel, it ferments. You don't need that mass.
Right.
And that's the difference. So to a certain degree, Burgundy, when it gets too small, it loses, it becomes is it better or not? And that's always an interesting intellectual conversation to have between for the real what you call it, aficionados.
Do you think that's the basis of? I'm going to ask this question. I mean, how much of the volume of Pinot Noir, let's use the red only, is negociant based versus estate bottled? What percentage of Burgundy is negociant?
That's a good question now. Maybe 50%.
Yeah.
But I think the other thing with negociant, and we should define that. Remember, a negociant in Burgundy or in France is anybody that buys grapes from other people. And in California, people consider themselves winemakers. They're always buying and selling wines. We don't make that distinction. The big difference, what happened in the mid 2000s, 2004, 5, 6, many of the small producers were who used to sell me grapes, were now not selling me grapes, and they were buying in grapes themselves. So what you have is this proliferation of the last 10 or 15 years of many other micro negociants, or micro winemakers who are buying in grapes from other people. And so the distinction between pure grower and pure negociant is much less than it used to be. And you'll find many producers don't even put on the bottle now if there's a distinction between domain, grapes they grow themselves, or grapes they buy in as negociant.
That was one of the questions I had, because in 1993, I mean, it's still modern times for winemaking in Burgundy, but how much change, we'll talk about climate change in a second, but how much change in the industry, because the industries across the world are going through major changes. The distribution of wine, the selling of wine, the direct consumer in America, all this stuff is radically different than it was pre-COVID. But I'm wondering if since 1993, what did you see besides this? Was it pretty traditional still in 1993, or it had gone through some changes already?
It was beginning. I would say late 80s, early 90s. There were changes in the winemaking, the curiosity in different winemaking styles, trying to learn from, if you will, the new world, with machines and whatnot. More importantly was actually the viticulture, which is less interesting to the wine drinker, because all we want to think about is technique. But what was happening was we were going back to what the grandfathers did, rather than, and I don't want to say it was all becoming bio and organic and all that, but it was the beginning of that, of let's see, we don't need to spray the vines all the time. Let's try some, if you will, homeopathic methods. Let's do more plowing. Let's use compost rather than chemical nitrogen fertilizers. And that has made the big difference. And what's also interesting is that people then were dropping fruit to get more concentration. Well, what's happened over these last 30 years, both good and bad, is that those yields have actually dropped on their own because of the biodynamic farming, but also climate change, weather pattern changes, viruses that are getting into the vines. I mean, we can go down this rabbit hole. I could talk for hours, Paul, about this. This is one of the reasons I decided to get out and sell my business 4 years ago. I was 62, and I'm going, I need another generation to figure out what's going on, to deal with all these changes. And I think it's time to pass it on to basically my kids' age.
Uh-oh, I lost you for a second. Did you mute that? You're gonna have to. Something happened.
There we go. I got it. There we go. I hit the wrong button.
Okay, let me just let's call it 20 minutes. I'll edit that out. Well, you said something very important. The steward of land. I mean, wine. Yeah. I tell the story all the time that any new burgeoning wine district is going to learn that it takes at least 50 years, to figure out what a particular vineyard can do because of all the variables that are going to go into each vintage, and you only get one chance a year to figure it out. So here, Burgundy's got 1,000 year, 800 years worth of history to understand, and you really are a steward of the land. And it's kind of interesting. You would say that at your age, I'm 64, and I just did exactly the same thing, but on the business side of wine,
right.
I didn't feel like my generation was. I've learned a ton about digital marketing. I sent 30 million emails out last year. I mean, we get it, but there's another change coming, and you're saying, look, we've got to steward this thing and continue to grow it and continue to evolve with it, and that's what most Burgundian winemakers will tell you. That
absolutely,
I'm working for the next generation.
I mean, I really feel that we're custodians of this. The French term is patrimoine, basically this gift that God and the land has given us, and we have a responsibility to take care of it. And I would say my generation, the last 30 years, we've done a heck of a good job of getting away from all the chemicals and that kind of stuff that really became prevalent after the Second World War. But now with a very fast change in the growing conditions, the weather patterns, climate change, call it whatever you want. I don't want to get into the politics of it. But, the reality is in 2003, that was the first vintage we've had maybe in 80 years, 70 years that started before September 1st. Since then, we've had 10, 15. So it's changed very, very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I think that is what is going to require new viticultural practices, canopy management. As I mentioned, the vines, this is the other piece that I think people don't realize. If you're farming, if you will, organically, to keep it, and you use the American term, you're doing a lot more plowing, you're turning the soil. And also what happens is you're going to hit vines, you're going to break off, you're going to kill vines, even if you're very, very careful. Mm-hmm. And let's say you're lucky and you only kill 1%, 1.5% a year through disease and accidents. Well, it takes 5 years mm-hmm. to get any decent grapes, and actually longer than that. So at any given time, you're operating at less than a 95%, 93% efficiency on your land.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Throw that. So you think about that. So you're not running 100%. Let's say you're running even 95%, but you got to keep replanting those. And it's every year, it's the same thing. Or you get frost and you lose a lot. I mean, or you get 3 years in a row of hail. I had to pull out a vineyard because at a certain point after the frost and 3 years in a row of hail, there was virtually no crop. I said to the team, my team, and this was after the frost of 2016, I said to the team, let's just pull the vines out. Don't touch. I said, cut off everything. Don't touch it. We'll pull them out in the fall because I don't want to waste any more money. I mean, those are the hard business decisions you have to make that the consumer never really it's part of the pun. We're getting in the weeds here about how you actually manage this. And it's not as if we have 300 acres. We're talking about maybe in this case, this was my best Bourgogne basic Pinot Noir where I sold at the lowest price possible. That was 2.5, 3 acres, fantastic vineyard that was out.
Wow.
And then people ask me, well, where's your $30 bottle of wine retail? And I go, well, I don't have the vineyard anymore for at least 5 or 7 years.
Fascinating.
And then finally, people go, well, just go buy grapes from someone else. I go, but everyone's grapes in my area got hails on also.
Yeah, right.
I mean, it's not just because I'm a bad guy, God doesn't like me.
Right.
It's everybody. I mean, this is the proverbial act of God.
And so I think it's the peril of the industry that, particular in Burgundy, and let's sort of discuss that new world, old world idea, because the French are so keen on protecting their culture. And so they have appellations in wine. They have appellations for butter. They have appellations for fromage, for cheese. They have it for everything in order to protect, and the rules that protect those regions keep the identity of those regions going. We don't have that in America. Profit is our main goal in terroir and appellation. So, if we had that problem that you had, we'd go to Lodi or we'd go to the Central Coast and we'd go find somebody's stuff and we'd blend it out. And that's what happens. It's kind of frustrating.
I mean, it's a totally different game. And I mean, that's called winemaking as a business versus winemaking as the French would say, métier, as a profession.
Mm-hmm.
And I love the word vigneron. It doesn't mean winemaker. It actually means wine grower.
Mm-hmm.
Literally, bloody bottle of wine was growing on the vine. We don't have that same, actually, the 3 or 4 different, real definitions for it. And so it's a whole different way of looking at it. And then, as I said, you got to sell this stuff. Every 12 months, we have a new baby coming, being delivered, and the same problems again and again. It's wonderful, but it's not for the faint of heart. It takes a lot of energy. As the French would say, les reines de fer, iron, steel kidneys. We would say something else.
Oh, yeah. Yes, I know that word. My granddaughter had her kidney removed actually at 3 years old, and I learned the French term for that, having those conversations. Well, this is important stuff for the listeners and for to define the differences between the industries. And I have this question because, there's 2 parts of this conversation that I want to go. One, we'll attack the climate change in just a minute, because I agree this is not a political show. And though when you read the historical accounts of Champagne, about Burgundy, I mean, 1940 was this horrible vintage in Burgundy because it frosted like in June, right? So that's bizarre. And that's long before all the hype about climate change. And what about the mini ice age that went through, Champagne and Chablis and those areas in the 1700s? I mean, Madame Clicquot was fighting off what looked like a 15-year cold snap. So it's just part of our industry that we have to deal with it. But I think it was after the war, there was a meeting and there was some appellation discussion, and it was a Burgundy meeting. And one of the winemakers said, I want to include the rule basically that you can't advertise your wine. And of course, that got gunned down. But his comment was basically based on the idea that if we make good enough wine, people will come and buy it, and we shouldn't be advertising because our job is just to make good wine. Okay, I kind of like that sort of authentic, ethereal value, but that's not real. But what would it be? This is a tough question. I ask it all the time of winemakers. What would this industry be like if we didn't have to worry about profit? Would we make something different? Would we treat the vineyards different? Would we be more cognizant or less cognizant of certain things if we weren't fighting that annual requirement to sell off what we made because we have to make a profit for the next year?
That's a good question. Well,
it's a tough one. I know.
Well, I know that with me and many of my colleagues in Burgundy, when someone comes in and doesn't have a lot of money, but is very enthusiastic. And we start opening bottles, and I open something old that's absolutely sublime, and the person is transported. I'd give it away if I could. That is what I love. I got, or that's the artist side of my head. Half of me is man, half is the artist. And that's what I want to please. The idea when we do this is we want, one, we love what we do, but two, I want to make something that's pleasing to people, that gives them pleasure, something that's beautiful. So much, as I would say, ugliness in this world, so much banality in this world, that when you can give someone something that transports them, whether it's a beautiful piece of architecture, a painting, a sculpture, all that, because music, I mean, the idea, when we're talking in France, that when you're talking at wine at this level, it's about gastronomy, which is the art of food and wine. So it's an art, and then the French term connaissance, as in knowledge, as in
Knowledge.
connoisseur is not a foo-foo word. It means you have knowledge about something. And that's what Burgundy requires. It's a bit like they used to say about the taxi drivers in London. They had to learn the knowledge. You have to have a knowledge of your profession and your métier. And that's what makes Burgundy so wonderful and so complex and so paradoxical at the same time. And I think that's what draws people back. And the good news, and going back to your question about what's happened in 30 years, there's never been more better Burgundy out there than there is now. Because, when I got there 30 years, there was some pretty bad rubbish, some pretty bad stuff. And the change in 30 years is huge. And it will continue to get better and better. But you'll never have massive brands, because it's just of the nature of, going back to the Napoleonic Code, inheritance laws, and also basically rules that protect the farmer. It's not a lot different than rules that protect our farmers here, and whatnot. So there's a coherence to it once you learn it. But again, it's its own special world.
What a fascinating trip. A trip being a voyage, because you've learned what I'm going to call the indigenous part of this industry in one of the most indigenous winemaking districts of the world. And to hear it coming from an American is quite fascinating, because I've interviewed a lot of winemakers, and particularly Burgundians, and it's their perspective. But here's a perspective in English, well-spoken English, that sort of is changing my perspective on, what I've seen all these years. And one of the things that's interesting, you brought it up a little bit. I had a friend who was going to go to Burgundy. He wanted me to get him a couple appointments. One of them said absolutely, and then they had to change. But he went out to buy one of the wines so that he would show up at the winery with a little bit of knowledge as to what they have. And he went to the supermarket and he bought the entry-level Bourgogne Blanc. And I'm like, I go, man, that's not going to tell you anything, because the stuff we get here, that's entry-level Burgundy, it angers me, because it has no representation of what you possibly could drink when you go there. And it's unfair to the wine for it to be representing against California Chardonnays that are all over oaked and have all this character in them and are voluptuous wines. And you get this thin acidic piece of Chardonnay, and you kind of go, I don't like French Chardonnay, because you taste this one entry level thing. And guess what?
Right.
At the supermarkets, that's all there ever is. Right. So
I think you got, you used to have several we call speeds in Burgundy. Now you have 2 speeds. 2/3 is very good, and that is primarily the high-end restaurants, high-end retailers, and export. okay, in Burgundy. Then you have probably that last third that you'll still see in the grocery stores in France that is usually pretty lousy.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the stuff that's exported now, I mean, my basic Bourgogne Chardonnay, Bourgogne Blanc, and Bourgogne Pinot Noir were always very, very much higher level. And because I had to make, I guess the whole idea is that you need to, if you're a winemaker, if the winemaker is not making great basic Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, his other wines will probably not be good either. Okay. That's the reality. And so I always try to make my Pinot Noir and Chardonnay at a much, much higher level. And people go, wow, this is great. I mean, I go back and I'm tasting my 2014 Chardonnay right now. It's Saban.
Wow.
I wish I had another 50 cases. I mean,
Yeah.
I'll
Call
send
Jean
you-
Charles, see what he's got.
No, you know what? I actually bought back most of it myself.
Oh, did you?
Because I didn't want it to get to be discounted out to the grocery stores.
Okay, that's
So
funny.
So I shipped it in and sold to my friends.
It's actually
think
very funny because when I sold the company, the buyer only wanted all the wines that I had here that were used for subscription, part of the subscription. And during
Right.
COVID, I was able to accumulate some amazing wines, lots of Burgundy, because at that time in COVID, they were buying whatever I told them to buy. And so I'm like, I had a lot of cash flow to do what I wanted. Well, he didn't want them. So I actually have a gentleman in my home today finishing a $2,000 bottle cellar for me.
Oh,
'Cause
wow.
I've got to find a place to put this stuff. And I'm so excited to put it there because I get to drink it now. But
That's funny.
of course, my wife, the accountant's like, well, we could have sold it before. I'm like, oh, well, you can't sell it now, so it's no problem. Well, I suppose that comment's no different than what we wrestle with this industry, and that is the Apothic Reds and the Josh Cabs. And those are the entry-level brands. They don't represent anything as to the quality and the pedigree of what a California wine can be like or a Napa wine. But they are on the shelf. People buy them. They like them, and that's how we get people drinking wine. And maybe that's what the point is. But I have this sort of romantic outlook on Burgundy and all of France, actually, most of it, sort of a Francophile here, that there's so much more to understanding wine than the price and the sugar content.
Right.
And if
Right.
you give somebody a chance, and this is one of the comments I make, and I want to hear your comment on it, whether or not somebody likes Pinot Noir, whether they like Chardonnay, or whether they like Pinot Meunier, or whatever they do or don't like in general, you can almost always count on when you present a nice example of something, let's say, like a Chambon Musigny, like you said, or even an entry-level Burgundy Rouge, that even a novice will say, this is pretty good. This is pretty interesting. I kind of understand this. And they don't have to like it. They don't want to spend the money on it, whatever it is. But it always seems like that an honest glass of wine, a humble glass of wine, a properly made glass of wine, unplayed with, piques somebody's interest.
Absolutely. The whole idea when I was making wine, I call it transparency. You pick the grapes at the right time, you treat them correctly, you have clean methods, and you bottle correctly, you're going to come out with a pretty good bottle of wine. And then if you're getting that from a very, very good vineyard or a good vineyard, it's going to be pretty darn good.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not that hard. It's just attention to a lot of details. I always tell the story, what goes wrong in a 3-star restaurant when, the restaurateur has bought the best food, cooked it correctly, but then that last 5%, the waiter lets it sit under the hot lights and it gets dry and it goes out, and all this 95% of what that chef did is perfect. That last little detail. And I say, we do everything perfectly, and then we put it on our importer, and he doesn't use a refrigerated container, and it gets back to the United States, and it's off, it's cooked a little bit or whatever. That means all of that 99% I did for, and actually it's a almost 3-year process from one vintage to finally that wine arrives, goes poof.
That's,
and that's
you're right.
that's the frustration. So, when you're whether you're a big operation or a small operation, I mean, I was a stickler for detail. And nothing. It was like nothing fancy. Are all the tanks clean? Is the couverie air, is the winery air conditioned when it should be? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then it kind of works out.
Do you think the French are more attuned to that? I mean, when my daughter went to pastry school in Saint-Jean outside of Lyon there, and we went and visited her, I'm like, wow, this kitchen is like phenomenal. And we went to Michelin star restaurant in Lyon Orsi, and the guy took us in the kitchen. It's a 30-year-old kitchen. You would it looked like it was installed yesterday.
Absolutely.
And there's this amazing passion because of what you're saying.
I mean, I always say, when you're working it, a winery is messy. A kitchen, when it's being used, is a madhouse. But when the day is over, you're cleaning it down, because leaving sugar around, you get bacteria, and with bacteria, you get you get problems. Only bad things happen with bacteria. But you keep cold food cold, hot food hot. Make sure you bring your grapes in, you process them the right way. You buy great meat, you keep it cold till you cook it. I mean, it's not rocket science.
But yes, but it goes back to profitability, and I think passion for this.
Discipline. It's discipline and attention to detail is what it is.
So here's one of my pet peeves right now, and it's and I've had a wonderful conversations with people that are on the wrong side of this pet peeve, but that's okay. That's what this show's about, is to present all the ideas, and this is the concept. Instead of the passion to find the right grapes for what you're trying to bottle, to farm the land the way you want it, to create the wine you want to make, instead of the passion for that, the passion for presenting this idea of a product which you just brought up, that is the best that you can make it, and it all the way through the processes and properly handled. We have a huge group, a very large part of America. It's the capitalist part of America, which is fine, going after things like the packaging of wine as their fulcrum into the industry. So I don't care. I'm not going to worry about what I'm putting in this can. I'm not going to worry about what I'm putting in this Tetra Pak. I'm not worried about what I'm putting in this PET bottle. I'm more worried about the packaging itself. And I hope that one day I get enough shelf presence that some big company comes and buy me and I retire. And this frustrates me in this industry, because wine to me is more romantic, more ethereal, more philosophical than that. But we have people in today's environment thinking that, well, I'm going to make $1 billion because I'm going to can some wines.
Yeah.
It seems to be against the grain.
I don't disagree with you, but at another level, if we can get a new generation of wine drinkers in because of that, then it's a good thing. Because the reality is that you and I and our contemporaries, we have enough wine in our cellar, Paul. Well,
as much other bottles.
I got more than that. Okay, we got and so these kids, and I'll use that term loosely, but the 20, 30-year-olds, they're not drinking wine, and that's a problem for the industry. And I think if you can somehow get them to actually rather than they're drinking the craft beers, they're drinking the cocktails in the mocktails, wherever it is in the can and all that. That's not they drink these sugary drinks, these sugary cocktails, not my cup of coffee. All right. But if we can get people to, as I said, if there's a cute little koala bear on the can and they buy it and they go, well, this is good, let's try something else, then it's a good thing. The money part, America's got capitalism, but I'm worried about the next generation because actually wine consumption is actually down a lot.
It is.
It is.
But
And I think
I don't have that fear though. And I don't have that fear because of it's 6,000 years old. I'm Armenian. I went and visited the cave last 2 months ago where, they found the guy's shoe and he was making wine and they showed the path and the fermentation tanks in the amphora. I mean, I think, and this kind of goes back to the comment I made about presenting a proper glass of wine to somebody that no matter where they're at in their career as a wine enthusiast, those good ones really pique people's interest. I think eventually the value of that beverage comes full circle when we're adults. If you're drinking White Claw today and I suppose you're accurate, we stocked my dad. You can see my father in this picture right here, 1975. We stocked Matus and Lancers and Gallo Rhine wine and Red Burgundy and Bartles and James and all those things in my dad's shop. And I suppose White Zinfandel's roll in 1974 was the same thing.
Yep.
And I suppose I can't romantically expect to miss that. But so you headed in to pick up your wife now, as they're doing?
Actually, she is going to start driving and I'm just changing to the passenger seat so we can continue to talk.
This is the most mobile show I've ever done.
I know. Tell you, who would have thought? Who would have thought it? And we have really good 5G here. So
we only got 4 minutes left anyway. So it's
okay.
Not that. This show runs, by the way, on radio in a couple of states, and it's being picked up by other shows. So I keep the timing very specific to what we're doing. So actually, since this is I wrote something down when you were talking, and you said when I was making wine, and I started to think, I go, how bizarre is that? How bizarre is it that there was this guy from Washington D.C. who was in the real estate business, probably a developer, stumbled across a wine shop, met Becky Wasserman, staged in Burgundy, and that's not easy to do in itself because the European Union does not like visitors sticking around too long. So that took probably some legal issues. And then built up a vineyard and a winery and a brand, and then sold it to one of the biggest, in the world, and is now in Idaho saying, when I was making wine.
It is pretty funny. My mother said, who would have thunk it, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's crazy. This is a book. It's called Wine is the Best Medicine. It's a French doctor from the 70s. His name was Dr. Maury. And he was, I'm going to put you on the spot here. He was a MD, but he was also a homeopathic doctor. And basically, it's a book of maladies, human maladies. I'm going to give you one. I'm going to give you 3 of the wines that could cure this malady, at least alleviate the symptoms. Now, I can tell you that since I give you 3 choices, the current running accuracy of any answer is 33%. So no one really hasn't figured it out. But it's kind of like the master of wine test or master song. Like, why did you choose that answer more than the answer? So let's just say you. Let's pick this. Let's pick nervous depression. Who doesn't have that, huh? So you could have a Medoc Red, you could have a Côte de Beaune, or you could have some dry champagne. And there's a dosage with this. So it's a Medoc, a Côte de Beaune, or a dry champagne to help with your nervous depression.
I would say champagne.
Why?
It always makes you happy. The bubbles makes you happy. Champagne always makes me happy.
When I speak to people like Clovis Tétanger and the Boulangers, they're like, this is not celebration wine. This is like drink it all the time wine, right? Cremant, Burgundy.
That's it.
Right?
Well, I do drink a lot of bubbles all the time too.
That's
why I'm also very happy.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I'm sorry, that was the wrong answer. The answer was the Medoc Red, and the reason Dr. Murray says that is that the deficiency is the technocratic civilization earn unheard of profits, and the deficiency sometimes responsible for these states of psychic fatigue is phosphorus deficiency. Phosphorus being an essential nutrient of the nerve cell. The recommended wine is the red Medoc. Why? Because the glycerin it contains combines in the intestine with the phosphase of the fermented grape juice to form glycerol phosphates of natural lime. So now, what's the dosage? That's an important part of this. How many glasses of Medoc should you have a day to cure your nervous depression? Well, it's
How many glasses?
2 before each and during meals. So you're talking about a bottle a day.
I
So-
think that's about right.
That's fair enough, isn't it? Huh?
Yeah. Yep.
I'm good. I'm good with that.
I got no problem with that, man.
I will say a couple of these maladies, Dr. Murray will say, well, we're not sure why, but you feel better anyway. So what the hell?
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating conversation. I hope we can do it again and continue what you're doing after all this and all the conversation again about Burgundy. And we have many subjects to touch on, but it's been a pleasure having you. I'm glad it worked out.
Thank you, Paul. It was great fun, and good luck to you. And let's talk again soon. And remember, buy that book, Climbing the Vines. You can get
Climbing
it
the Vines.
online, and especially at any of your independent bookstores.
Climbing the Vines in Burgundy. And is it, it's published out now?
Yes, it's out. It came out last week by Hamilton Books. It's available at every bookstore and online at all the normal places. But try to support the independent bookstores. They need it, and it actually is better for me. Be perfectly honest. That's you talk about a crazy business. The algorithms like it from independent bookstores. Go figure, but that's the way it is.
Well, there's a wonderful shop in Hermosa Beach. I'll visit that, and I look forward to reading it and talk soon.
Thanks again. Appreciate it.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Wine Talks with Paul Kalamkarian. Don't forget to subscribe because there's more great interviews on their way. Folks, have a great time out there in the wine world. Cheers.